everybody please stand for the entrance of the Colour Party and remain standing for the Singing of Old Canada led by Peter Frostad.
Oh, Canada, our home and native land, true patriot love, in all our songs command. With glowing hearts we see thee rise, the true north, strong and free. From far and wide, O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. God keep our land, glorious and free. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee.
Thank you. Please be seated. And happy 151st birthday, Canada. Welcome to Strasbourg District Museum and our medal presentations program today. We've been looking forward to this day for many months here in Strasbourg. My name is Larry Michalchik, a former museum board member and obviously a Silton Legion number 33 member. I've been asked to act as the MC for our program today. What I want to start with though today, I've added a segment to the program, a short little segment. I wanted to read a little bit from a pedagogical guide actually about history and practice that I just received a few days ago at a conference I was at, but it talks about artifacts. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs from pedagogy written by Karen Swan, not Schwandt, Swan, from, doesn't say where, but I'm pretty sure it's a Canadian author, so I would guess probably the Ontario region. She says, when we learn, we need both the artifacts and their historical context to grasp the full story. Understanding artifacts depends upon a written or spoken narrative. Without it, they are merely relics of a time long past and little understood. At the same time, survivor testimonies are more likely to be internalized when they are enhanced by relevant, tangible artifacts. Without such evidence, the narratives might be tales difficult to envision and sometimes soon forgotten. Yet together, the artifacts and the narratives transform the mundane into the exceptional. Daily items become the closest things we have left of the people who owned and valued them. The simple artifact and its story become a lens through which we suddenly see a fact, a person, a moment of the history differently, and in much sharper focus. Artifacts help us to feel history, the truth of a person, a place, a moment, and when seen within the context of their story, they enrich our factual knowledge as well. Every day of history consisted of moment-by-moment thoughts, dilemmas, and decisions of individuals. Millions of people who lived lives like ours until their world was torn apart and turned upside down. Each artifact that we discover, whether in film, a painting, a poem, a testimony, a museum, or our grandparents' dresser drawers, help us to know how individuals just like us respond to that cataclysm, how they lived each difficult day. So I thought that very adequately framed the importance of receiving artifacts in a museum, especially artifacts that have such a storied history as the medals that we are going to see today. At this point, I'm going to introduce to you Sergeant Dorsett, who's going to speak very briefly today about service. Sergeant Dorsett, son of Bobby and Dale Dorsett, enrolled in the Canadian Forces in the early 2008 as a combat engineer in Edmonton, Alberta. He has taken a significant amount of training and was promoted to corporal in 2013 and served as section commander in the 25th Engineer Squadron. After continued training, he was promoted to sergeant in 2015, and within a week, he was tasked with being to be acting troop warrant for the 25th Engineering Squadron, which added significant responsibilities. Sergeant Dorsett is currently nominated to the Joint Combined Exchange Task Force and is preparing to participate in explosive threat training in the United Kingdom. His long-term goals include continuing to support engineer training at the troop level with an eye towards reprising his role as troop warrant. Please welcome Sergeant Dorsett.
Ladies and gentlemen, Legion members, special guests, my name is Sergeant Dan Dorsett. I'm a reserve combat engineer and I grew up on a farm near Strasbourg. The job of a combat engineer is to allow friendly troops to live, move, and fight on the battlefield and to deny those same to the enemy. We build it or we blow it up. Combat engineers are the Army's demolition experts, and they are the bomb squad. I've been asked to speak today on the importance of service. When I joined the military, we were at the height of our mission to Afghanistan. The instructors on my training courses were veterans of Afghanistan, or Bosnia, or both. In the military, I was raised on the stories of men and women who'd had their boots on the ground in very torn and desolate countries. As my career progressed, I was able to hear how they had served their country and how in so doing they were able to serve the people of the countries that they were posted to. My instructor, then Corporal Grenard, told me over a beverage or three about setting up flash field hospitals in Afghanistan. They would often be the only example of medical aid the entire region had ever seen. He talked about being able to save children who had never seen an actual doctor in their lives. Children suffering conditions that we rarely think of here, like cholera and dysentery. When Calgary was flooded in 2013, the muddy old engineers were on the ground, providing security, trenching waterways, and sandbagging neighborhoods. When BC was on fire last summer, we were there with saws and shovels, building fire breaks and saving homes. In my own experience, service has not been as much a sacrifice of my own time, toil, and treasure as it has been a benefit to me. It has motivated me to keep fit and to embrace lifelong learning. I've been able to give back to my family, I've been able to give back to my community and to my military. I have a family beyond my blood. I could walk into any legion in any town and find brothers and sisters in arms. I have placed soldiers with post-traumatic stress disorder into care, and I have received support in my own times of crisis. I have taught young people, in my turn, that they are stronger than they ever thought they could be. I've seen them shine when they discover that they can hold fast under dire circumstance. And it has been my distinct honor to do so. The Canadian Armed Forces is certainly not for everyone. It requires dedication, effort, and sacrifice, no little part of which comes from my wife and children, who did not get to choose. However, service in many forms is an option that is available to us all. Most often, victory comes from many small, correct actions. Good things are good because good people make them good. I urge you to think about your community, your friends, and your family. Who can you help? Where can you make a difference? I'm not the first to observe this, but it is a good reminder. You make a living on what you get. You make a life on what you give. Make it good. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. You've done an excellent job in framing the importance of service here for us today and for the work that people who volunteer their lives to the service have, the impact that they have. At this point in our program, I'm going to call up Roger McCrae, who is going to briefly describe for us how this whole project began.
Things have changed up here for me. I thought I was going to be talking to a few groups of my family. Give me my bona fides. My great-grandparents, Joanna and Julius Swan, homesteaded in Strasbourg in 1893, about a mile and a half south of the present golf course. So that puts us on the land for just over 100 years when my cousin Bill owned it, the fourth generation to have owned that farm, and Eric at the back and Jane somewhere would have been the fifth generation to have worked that land. So that's the bona fides here. My grandparents, W.L. and Louise Schwandt, sent 3 sons to war. Ted, Fred, and Art, and Grandma's sister and my grandfather's cousin just down the road, Gus and Mary Schwandt, also sent 3 boys to war. Chas, Spud, and Eddie. Eddie did not return. My brothers and I have always been fairly interested in the World War II history. We grew up just after the war and were very aware of it, and Uncle Fred had remained in the Army, so that became part of it. Last year, we decided that we would make a trip that we've always wanted to take, which was landing at Juno Beach and then working our way north up through France and Belgium, Holland, and into Germany, which was basically the Canadian route. The route we followed most closely was the South Saskatchewan Regiment, which is out of Weyburn, but both Uncles Ted and Fred were with the South Saskatchewan Regiment. So through the planning, we ended up with Tricia and Darlene, my cousins, Fred's daughters, coming along, so the 4 of us started the trek. Our first day was at Juno Beach, and not really knowing what to expect. It's an absolutely phenomenal museum at Juno Beach. The part about Juno Beach, which Canadians should well know, is that there were 5 beaches on D-Day. By the way, the shirt is purchased there and worn here today on purpose. 5 beaches, 2 American beaches, 2 British beaches, and a Canadian beach. Don't forget now, Canada didn't have much of a population, but we had 1/5 of the beaches. Ours was considered the second most difficult beach after the U.S. Omaha Beach. Canadian Army was the only army to reach its objectives that day. They got further inland than any of the other forces. The first film of the battles in Normandy were taken by Canadian filmmakers of the Canadians in their battles. That film was seen in London and New York. We weren't mentioned in it. Kind of like Roger Dangerfield. We didn't get no respect. So at Juno Beach, and since then, there's a brick wall, and I wasn't aware of it, but the Strasbourg community has had all of their veterans recognized on the brick wall at Juno Beach. We have our pictures there, but didn't realize at that time that we could have been looking up our boys. I know the veterans here have done one of them. I know the school has been responsible for some of those.
This gentleman right here.
That gentleman right here. And I've since found out that if you ever go, all you have to do is type their name in. It'll tell you exactly where the brick is on that wall. So we did see it, but unfortunately we weren't aware of that. While wandering that day, we went down to the British Beach of Gold because that's where, and this is the engineers, where the wharfs were set up, because an army travels on its stomach and they had to get equipment across from England immediately, so they shipped wharfs across. They were supposed to last 90 days. They're still there, kind of half submerged. But while there was a group of senior French, and I say senior, they were a bit older than me. So you must realize now that I was a wartime baby. These people were actually they were in the occupation. And so we got taking their pictures, they were taking pictures back and forth, and Tricia started practicing her somewhat rusty French with them, and they were practicing their English on us. And as it came out that we were Canadians and that their father had been there and our uncles had been there, they actually embraced us. We did get the kiss on each cheek. We got, from the heart, France thanks you. They really do remember us there. And then the next day we started our march up north, and kind of where we went to, always hearing the stereotype of the French not caring, not caring. I have never seen more Canadian flags in my life than as we went north up through France. There were flags on town halls, there were flags on schools, there were special chapels built by the roadside with Canadian flags on them. There were bricks inlaid in town squares with the Canadian flag. Little cairns by the side of the road. Our flags were everywhere. And many of them, because we were specifically choosing this route, were dedicated specifically to the South Saskatchewan Regiment. There were other names we would continually recognize, the Winnipeg Rifles, the Scottish Canadian, which our Uncle Ed was with, Winnipeg Regina Rifles, because both Regina Rifles and Scottish Canadians were in on the Juno. South Saskatchewan didn't come in until a couple of days later. Again, as I talked, kind of a few notes here, Tricia wore her dad's hat badge the entire time we were there. She had it on her handbag, and often we would, beside the road, there'd be a cairn for the South Saskatchewan Regiment, so we would snap pictures of that. At the Abbaye des Ardennes, and you may not be familiar with this one, 20 Canadian prisoners of war were actually executed by the SS under Kurt Meyer, kind of a day of infamy. But while we were there at the Abbey, showing our respect for these executed soldiers, there was a group of young French very solemnly also paying their respect to our boys. Our memories are very, very much alive. Remembering some of these battles that we went through, the Germans had not just capitulated on this. They were ready to fight for everything. We lost more Canadians at Caen than we did at Juno. We lost more Canadians at a very Ridge than we did at Canada. Very Ridge is a ridge overlooking Verrier, the whole valley. The South Saskatchewan actually liberated the town, but there were many Canadian infantry divisions taking over this ridge. And at the top, the plaque reads up there, and I have trouble with this one. It's, "Well may the wheat and sugar beets grow green and lush upon the gentle slopes. For in that half-forgotten summer, the best blood of Canada was freely poured upon them." It's just overwhelming then and still is now. In Rouen, which is very close to where, we would call him Uncle, but his double cousin, who was actually Deb's uncle. Ed was killed by a sniper. The shell holes and the bullet holes have been left in the town hall on purpose as a reminder, and when we were there inspecting this, because the SSR had also been there, Tricia always announced she had a Canada sweater on, and there was again an elderly lady, a couple of years older than me, and she came over, and again, it was in French, which Tricia understood, which was, I'm not sure, but again, it was La Cour, from the heart, France thanks you, and got that lovely embrace again. We were able to, Tricia always carried Canadian pins with her, so she handed her the flag pin, and that's in the heart of the big city. Of course, Dieppe, the home of the botched, the South Saskatchewan Regiment was the first invasion of the continent. They were there in 1942, and it was a botched operation. Pretty much everything went wrong, could go wrong. We lost more people, more SSR men there than we did at any point. And so in 1944, the SSR liberated Dieppe. So there was twice that they were there. The second times they were the liberators. When we got in there were Canadian flags everywhere because they were celebrating Canada's 150th birthday that week with a Canada Film Festival. Basically, I guess almost the town was out. Tricia was busy handing pins out to pretty much everybody. And then afterwards they would show them to me. There was a chateau at the end of the street with a huge flower garden, which was the Canadian flag. And on our way out of town, we gassed up at Esso Canadian. We drove down more Rue de Canada or Canadian Rue than I could imagine possible in going up through France. That was also a morning of personal sadness because that was the day that we visited Ed Schwandt's grave. Again, double parents. When we declared war on Germany, Britain declared war on Germany on September 3rd. We declared on September 10th. Canada had almost no standing army. We didn't have a military draft. The US did, Britain did. Ours was all volunteer. Basically, the prairies went to war. This is actually chronicled in a book written by Jenny Morton, Prairie Town Goes to War. She was from just Dilk, I don't know if it was Dilk or Delka, I'm not sure, I think it's Dilk, I mean, just across the river, across the last mountain. And in it she talks about all of the volunteers. And in that book there are many mentions made of Ed, because he was a teacher in Dilk at the time, and she refers to him often as the much loved, the very favorite teacher, Ed Schwandt, because by this time he was over there. And then he had gone to Strongfield to teach, and that's where he joined up from Strongfield. And she refers to them, and she even mentions his death. For your information, if you're interested in the diaries, the daily diaries of all the regiments is now open. You just have to go online, just Google it in. And in the Diary of the Scottish Canadian, they actually mention any officer that's killed, they mention by name. And Lieutenant, I think it's E.G., his middle name was Gustav, after his father was killed today. That is in there, and she mentions it in the book too. At Strongfield, the town that he's teaching in, there is a cenotaph there with some names on it, as you have out here. But that one was done by apparently I don't know it, I haven't seen it. I will be going over to see it. A famous Saskatchewan artist, sculptor, and it's actually in the museum. It's a protected thing now. The school at Strongfield is closed, but it's there. The picture of it is online. If you go onto the Borcher War Memorials, my brother Stuart put it on with permission of the guy who took it. Reference is again made to it. The volunteers, Strasbourg, Duval, and Beaulieu area, and I got this from the book that was edited by my Aunt Marie, had over 400 volunteers. 8 of them were Schwants. Then we went into Newport, Belgium, kind of a easy entry for us. The SSR liberated it in 44, a much harder entry for them. And again, in the the daily log of the SSR, it is mentioned there without name. At the end of the month, it says 1 officer and 15 enlisted missing. We think that officer missing that day was probably our Uncle Ted, which Susan will be talking about later, very badly injured in Belgium. Kind of fast forward, we were able to go into the Hotel de Wereld in Holland, which is where the German officially surrendered to the Canadian troops on May 5th, and that is the celebration of the liberation of Holland. We were actually just able to walk into a room like this, same tables, same bar, same mirrors, everything on the wall, and had our pictures taken. Very, very, very moving. We then went to visit the grave of another of Strasbourg's volunteer boys, George Morrison. He was married to Grace. He was your barber and ran the pool room. And he volunteered, left a son, Dell, exactly my age. We were born the same year. Grace then became widowed and lived next door to Marie, became a great friend of Marie's and just a great neighbor of everybody. George was killed in Germany. And as my brother said, George was killed on March 27th, just before the ceasefires. And as Stuart said, he almost made it. He was actually killed in Germany, buried in Germany, but the Canadian general would not have any bodies left in Germany. So after the war, all of the bodies that were buried in Germany were brought back and buried in Holland. We were at his cemetery then that day. Again, just a very chill but proud feeling. At Christmas time, and this picture is online, there are 2,617 graves there. I think most of them are Canadians. The school children of the area light a candle and set it in front of every headstone, every Christmas. And there's pictures of this at Christmas Eve. On May 5th, they took Dutch citizens of the exact age of each of the buried soldier and had them stand by the grave. And that was just to show the impact of war and the impact of what we had done there. We were completely remembered. On our stay at Regiment, which is just up the road from that, this is where the SSR and our Uncle Fred had wintered before the final assault into Germany. And there is where we ran into something different. When we got into the hotel, we were right by a major bridge. They asked, "Are you here for the march?" And we said, "What march?" Because we were not aware of it. They said, "Oh no, every night at sunset, ever since the war, there has been a march across the bridge by at least 1 Dutch military personnel and anybody else that cares to walk along with them. As we walk across the bridge, sunset starts officially when the first street light goes on the bridge. At marching speed, as you walk across the bridge, marching at marching speed, the lights come on the bridge as we progress across." Very chilling, and then at the end of that, you go down to the bridge and there's a cenotaph there in memory of all the soldiers that were killed in the liberation of Holland in 44 and 45.
What's the name of that bridge, Rob?
You know, it was Regiment, and I don't know it. It's right by a hotel. It's a new bridge. It's a newer bridge, and I say, if you look down just off into that direction, you can see the bridge that Uncle Fred went across. So that one's within sight. And for those of you that are movie war buffs, if you've ever seen the movie A Bridge Too Far, or heard of the bridge too far, this is bridge number 4. The next one is a bridge too far that was not taken. And it was, that was, they were a little premature on that Operation Market Garden.
Right.
And at that point, Tricia said, we have to do something when we go home for Dad. And she talked to Susan, and they did. I will give you a quote from some notes, and I think Betty Ann and Wade are responsible for getting Uncle Fred to start talking about it, like many veterans. Didn't say much. Betty Ann and Wade had seen the movie The Big Band of Brothers, I believe. And I don't know how many of you know my cousin Betty Ann. You do not say no to Betty Ann. Right, Wade? Sorry. And got Uncle Fred talking about some of the things. I know Tricia has many of the stories as well. But here's a quote from Fred's writings then. And this is when they are now going into Germany. From then on, it was a normal war front. Attacks, patrols, more patrols, shells at night, river and canal crossings, shellings, digging in, just normal. This is from the lieutenant who is leading. That's what Canadian lieutenants did. They led. Here's a quote from another soldier. The Supreme Allied Commander, U.S. Army General Eisenhower, on the battle in northern Germany. The enemy troops fought with a fanaticism unexcelled at any time in the war. It was some of the fiercest fighting of the whole war. This is my uncle's hat badge from the South Saskatchewan Regiment, carried by Tricia as a talisman during us. So this hat badge has made the trek twice. Once in 44-45, and again last year. We finished off with a day at Vimy Ridge, and anybody who's been there, you know how impressive it is. And while we were there, there was one lonely piper, a Canadian, who had this on his to-do list. And we talked to him. And at that point, we finished our trip, and Tricia was finished as well, I assure you. And she's almost doing it again now. And said, when we go home, we are doing something for Dad. And then the twin, Ted, daughter Susan is there, and they have done something for their fathers. I now turn it over to my girl cousin. Karl, that's next. That comes later. Yep.
Great, Roger.
Karl. You just got a bit of, this is my journal of the trip. We spent most of our trip either in great laughter with good cousins or crying or tearing up.
Present. My name is Susan Swan. I'm Ted Swan's daughter. My cousin Tricia, Fred Swan's daughter, as we call her, sisters from another mother.
Yes.
Since we are the daughters of identical twins. And I didn't take this trip, so I've sort of shared some of these memories talking to Tricia and Darlene and to Roger. And thank you, Roger. That was really, we were there with you when you were discussing it, so thank you. And I really, want to thank you all for being here today, because it's a very fitting day in my mind, July 1st, Canada Day, what we're celebrating. And I think as Canadians, and I'll tell you from my generation, we can very easily forget. And even though my father served in the war, he didn't talk about it. And so for me to go back and to do the research I did in addition to what Tricia started was incredibly meaningful to me. And really, just a time today to honor the men and women who served before, the men and women who are serving now. I mean, it really is remarkable what you're doing. And from the bottom of our hearts, thank you so much. And which we're giving to the archive, which is there. But what we wanted to do to honor our fathers, and it's Fred on your left and his identical Ted on the right, is sort of a bit of reading into the record of their war history. It's not too long, but we'll give you a little bit of a little more of the color of what that was. And again, thank you for honoring them and for honoring the many people who allow us to live as we do in Canada. Frederick Johann and Theodore Heinrich were identical twins, born to W.L. and Louise Schwandt in a farmhouse outside of Strasbourg on February 28, 1919. Louise's sister Mary Heck, who lived just down the road with her husband Gus Schwandt, was the midwife. The twins, Fred and Ted, were the third and fourth surviving children in the family. Their older brother Art was born in 1911, sister Hertha 1913, and little brother Hal in 1925. The Schwandt and Wolfe families shared a unique family bond, as cousins W.L. and Gus Schwandt had married sisters Louise and Mary Heck. The 14 children of these two families, or double cousins as they called themselves, grew up working side by side on each other's farms, attending school together, playing sports, and sharing in many happy family times over the 1920s and 30s. War broke out in Europe in 1939, and a new bond was established in the family as Art, Fred, and Ted, and cousins Chad, Ed, and Spud all saw active service. Years later, Hal's wife, Auntie Marie, wrote a family history. Here's what she wrote about how the family coped with the boys off at war. The war was a trying time for the family. Art, Fred, and Ted all served overseas, and Louise put large maps on the wall in the kitchen of the farmhouse so they could follow the war battles. Norm James, the druggist, saved chocolates for the many parcels Louise and W.L. carefully packed to send to their sons. The war was trying, also because the manpower was gone from the farm. W.L. gave up his lovely flower garden, and with no hired man to help, he had to do the land work himself. Hal, who was going to school, continued to help on the farm, missing school during harvest and seeding. Julius Schwandt, W.L.'s and Gus's uncle, W.L.'s father and Gus's uncle, said he'd left Germany because of the fears of war, now had his grandchildren going off to fight the country he had come from, Germany. Fred and Ted were good farm boys, so they stayed around in the fall of 1940 until the crop was off the land. But in November, the 21-year-olds went to Regina and joined the South Saskatchewan Regiment. They remained in Regina for 2 years as instructors for recruits, and obviously caught the attention of commanding officers because they were promoted several times, and by 1941 both were sergeants. Fred and Ted continued to rise quickly through the ranks and were promoted to officer cadet in 1942 and then to second lieutenant following officer training in Quebec. Both Fred and Ted were posted to Camp Shiloh, Manitoba and Fort Garry in Winnipeg, where they took further training to advance to lieutenant. They also both met their future wives, Hazel Keenis and Wanda Warecki, in Winnipeg, so it wasn't all work and no play for the handsome Schwandt twin brothers. In early 1943, Fred was posted overseas to a training camp in Guildford, England, and several months later the twins were reunited at a British camp in London to take a 2-week course in street fighting. Soon they would join the South Saskatchewan Regiment on the battlefields. Ted was the first to go. On July 8, 1944, he crossed the Channel to Normandy and saw fighting across the northern parts of France and Belgium, including the liberation of Dieppe, Thiers Ridge, and the battle for Antwerp-Turnhout Canal. Meanwhile, Fred had been sent to a camp in England for further training as a sniper. After Ted left for the front, Fred was posted to a camp on the south coast near Brighton. Fred was able to contact cousin Ed Schwandt, and they spent a weekend together in London. Ed was older than the twins and had enlisted with the Canadian-Scottish Regiment, as Roger said after his time as a teacher in Crossfield.
Nope, Strongfield.
Strongfield, thank you. Following this time together, Ed returned to the continent and was soon killed in action near Rouen, France. He was 27 years old, the age of my oldest son right now. Ted was eager for Fred to join him on the continent. Over the early months of 1944, Ted wrote to Fred saying if he wanted to see any action, he'd better hurry and get over, as the war would be over in a few months. Fred got there in January of 1945, but he and Ted would not get the opportunity to serve side by side. In September 1944, Ted was serving in Belgium as a motorcycle courier. One night on an unlit road behind enemy lines near Newport, he hit a barricade and was seriously injured. He was found by a Belgian farm family who had heard the crash, and risking execution by the German army for helping an Allied soldier, took him in and got him back to his command. He was kept in a field hospital in Belgium and eventually evacuated to a hospital in England. Ted remained in hospital for several weeks and returned to Canada in early 1945. As a result of his injuries, he was discharged from the military for medical reasons on September 10, 1945. In my dad's own words, like many of my generation, I fought in the war, got wounded in the war, and perhaps not like so many, I do my best to forget about the war. In January 1945, Fred was posted to Europe to join his regiment.
So what I'm going to read is an excerpt from my dad's memoirs. He wrote these about 10 years before he passed. Roger's given us a little taste for some of it, so you'll recognize that section. But this was what he told us about being in war. So we sailed from Dover to Calais in a small landing craft that went by the famous French train that they said was called 40 men as 40 horses, and landed in Ghent, Belgium. The regiment held about a week for reorganization and then moved forward to join the SSR on the Dutch border with Germany. We were moving out into a forest waiting to cross the Rhine River. Here we were bombed a few times at night, but didn't have any casualties. Later we were moved by trucks to a bridge over the Rhine River. From there we marched for a night and a day to the front lines. From then on, it was a normal war front. Attacks, patrols at night, river and canal crossings, shellings, and forever on the move digging small slit trenches for protection. On one attack, we ran through our own smoke screen while the Germans shelled us. A shell landed in front of me, knocking me out for a few minutes. This blast in life later in life caused me to lose my hearing. About 3 weeks before the end of the war, I got an appendix attack at night. The next morning, I saw a unit doctor who sent me by ambulance to Holland for an operation. The medical unit was set up in a large school where I woke up in a bed with white sheets and was told that the war was over for me. From there, I was flown back by aircraft to a base hospital in Brussels. I was in hospital for 2 weeks, then went back to Ghent by train, and then back by truck to Crags. At 3 p.m., the bells rang out. The war was over. When we got to camp, there was no one there. Everyone was out celebrating. I found a bed, had a drink at the bar, and went to see the city lights come on that had been off for the last 5 years. There was a big dance in the town hall. I received a letter from Ted that he was going home, and I got a 1-week leave to go to England to see him before he returned to Canada. I was then sent to a unit on the north coast of Germany, then to a camp near Utrecht, Holland, until October 45, and then went back to England for a month. I left England November 45 and arrived in Canada at the end of November. I had first gone to war on the Queen Mary and was now coming back on the Queen Elizabeth ship. There was 10,000 troops on the ship at each time. I arrived in Quebec, took a train to Weyburn. There I met my folks and Hazel, and there was a big parade. I took a month leave and then reported back to Regina and decided to stay in the Army.
So following the war, my father returned to his parents in Strasbourg, and then he went back to Winnipeg and married my mother, Wanda, in November 1945. He entered the federal civil service, first working for the Department of Veterans Affairs and then Immigration, and he retired as Director of Immigration for the Prairie region in 1984. Sadly, he had quite a lengthy illness, and he died over 20 years ago in July 1997. As Tricia said, her dad, Fred, remained in the service and was posted to several countries as part of United Nations peacekeeping forces. In fact, Tricia was born in Germany when he was stationed there. Fred and Hazel settled in Calgary and with their 4 children and many grandchildren. And I moved to Calgary in 2005, and my uncle was still alive. And it was remarkable to me as twins to kind of, in a sense, see my father again, to see that smile and that laugh and that Schwandt sense of humor. And Fred, after the military, he worked in the military to 1968, retiring as major, and he began working with Phoenix Press and worked till he was 75, that good Schwandt work ethic, and retired, say, in 1994. And my Uncle Fred died on December 25th, 2007. So as you heard, 6 Schwandt cousins went to war and 5 returned. And I think, much can and has been said about the Canadians who've served in the war. As Roger said, we get no respect in terms of the World War record, but I think it's so important for us as Canadians to honor these folks. And I guess, today of all days, I'd like to kind of leave you with a quote to reflect on from a Canadian military historian, Tim Cook. No covenant was struck in 1939 or any other year between those who served and those who stayed at home, but there's a debt that must be repaid. At the very least, the nation must honor and remember both those who left, never returned, and those who left and returned changed forever. So thanks today for sharing our opportunity to honor our fathers and our uncles uncle and cousin we didn't know. And again, thank you so much to all of you who are continuing to serve our country.
thank you so much for both the lesson of the events of 44-45, as Roger was talking about your excursion. Brought back a flood of memories from my excursion 10 years ago, and then as recently as 4 years ago, and seeing those same places and experiencing that same love by the French people. It is quite remarkable, and I've said many times that there are more flags flying on, Canadian flags flying on buildings there than there are here, and it's so true. And now somebody else can confirm that I'm not just making it up. And to do things like walking the battlefield, where you can still pick up pieces of shrapnel or bullets that are, now quite rusty, but to know that they were weapons of war that are being farmed around and through in this day and age, and to see the land being turned back into a productive land is also very, very heartwarming. A footnote to Ed Schwandt. I have a farm some farmland not too far from Strongfield, and I just took some pictures of that monument here a couple of weeks ago because Strongfield is just outside our back door, basically. And my question was going to be to see if it's related to any of the Schwandts this way, because of some of the history. I know Deb and I have talked about the service of her dad and Ed in particular, because he's on the memorial in Juno Beach and here in the school. And so if you want to see some pictures, I've taken some pictures. It's beautifully repainted and clean, and flowers around it. It's right in front of the school that is no longer used as a school. It hasn't been a school for many years, but it's quite a beautiful monument. The detail on the statue of the soldier is remarkable. If they didn't use actual artifacts in the statue, then the sculptor paid great attention to detail. I quite encourage you to seek me out here after we're done to see some pictures of that. And just reflecting too on the resistance that these men encountered in Holland in particular. On my last excursion, there was reference made to the German kith and kin order, which was put into place to replenish the German soldiers, and so that when the Canadians went into Holland, they were facing brand new, freshly trained troops that were just itching for battle. So rather than it being a worn out German army as everybody expected, they ran into some of the very best that had been recruited and brought into service. So thank you very much for that history and for the dedication today. When you come up to have a look at the medals, I have made copies of the information about what each medal represents. These are in order of the medal sets here, so that you can see them. Although I don't know what United Nations operations that were undertaken. But these I'll leave with the museum, so if you can't see it today, we're leaving this here for you to have a look at when you can afford the time. Because that's quite an impressive medal set, that set that you see before you. At this time, I'm going to ask, and I'm not sure who is speaking, to Karl Wolfe. But yeah,
start
for sure, that'd be great. So we have one more set of medals that are being left here with the museum. So you would take that on. Thank you.
This is actually my brother Stuart's story. Stuart's in Toronto, couldn't be here. He's the one that we traveled with. The completely different story than what we had there. While we were getting all of this planned and talking about this back and forth, cousin Tricia sent us a picture of 4 German medals. And she said, I don't know where these came from. Dad has them, her father, Major Swan. Dad had them and he'd passed away, and now they've been given down to me. And all I know is that they came from a friend of our grandparents in Strasbourg, and I don't know anything beyond that. Stuart immediately had the answer. And so all I have to do is really read Stuart's reply. The print is a little small. If I hesitate, my reading isn't that bad. But this following story then is written by my brother Stuart about the medals that we have today and how they came into be the Schwandt family. It was likely in the summer of 61 or 62, and like many other summers, I was spending a good part of it in Strasbourg at my grandparents' home. That's W. and Louise. This summer was particularly interesting because my Uncle Fred was also there, and I was his helper as he did projects around Grandma and Grandpa's place. Spending time with Fred was always a pleasure, as he could tell a story like no other, and as he was still in the active service in the Canadian Army, he was the personification of a war hero to my 13-year-old self. As always, another frequent face at my grandparents' home that summer was Karl Wolfe. Now, those of you that have been around Strasbourg will know Karl Wolfe. I wasn't sure who it was. He lived across the alley from Grandma and Grandpa. which was beside Hank and Jenny Schwandt. And then talking to people, I found out that he didn't coffee just with my grandparents, he coffeed with Deb's grandmother, Mary, which would be our great Aunt Mary. And then found out from Karl Schultz that he used to go to the elevator and visit with Martin all the time. And I'm sure Betty Ann, Bill, and Gina and Doug have stories about Karl being around the village everywhere. He was a helper, a handyman. He worked at the elevators. He worked for my grandparents. And he was, and not a negative, he was a bit of a local character, the way he carried himself about. So as Stuart tells a story, another frequent face at my grandparents' home that summer was Karl Wolfe, their neighbor and friend from across the alley. I knew Karl well as he was a part-time hired hand. As a matter of fact, in I think about 1954, he was a hired hand. Grandpa was still stooking a little bit. We had an oat field and we had cattle on the farm, and so put some of it into stooks. And my brother Doug, who was here, would have been about 8 or 9, and Karl was teaching him how to stook, and the two of them stooked together that day. So the family history with Karl goes back a ways. And he visited Grandma and Grandpa regularly. He always greeted me, and this is Stuart's way, cheerfully, and asked about my parents and brothers. I have a clear memory of Karl with his big Kaiser mustache and a thick German accent sitting at my grandparents' kitchen table. And of course, I was thinking of the Grandma and Grandpa talking with Karl. Karl would be talking, and my grandpa would be going, yeah, yeah, yeah. And then it was Grandpa's turn, and Karl would go, yeah, yeah, yeah. That's pretty much the extent of my German, but it was always so entertaining. They spoke German because they like to keep their German up. And when we were there, as Stuart says, they would often speak English just because we were there and they didn't want to keep us out. So both Ma and Pa, well, they were known as Ma and Pa. They were also known as Uncle Billy and Aunt Louise because all of the Schwandt's family would refer to them as. And then later, they were always known in town as Grandma and Grandpa by the time Betty Ann was around. But anyway, they spoke German fluently, and Karl would speak English because he was there. Anyway, it was during one of these kitchen and conversations at my grandparents that Uncle Fred, with the Canadian military, and Karl turned the topic to Uncle Fred's military service. And Karl told Fred that he too was a war veteran in the German army in World War I. The next day, Karl came back with his medals. Uncle Fred was very interested. Uncle Fred was a military historian as well, very interested. So Uncle Fred was very interested and went over the medals with Karl. This was Stuart at the table, to understand what each was. I particularly remember him looking at the Iron Cross Second Class and how it impressed Uncle Fred. As a 13-year-old sitting with the two war veterans, one now serving for World War II in Canada, the other serving for World War I in Germany, and both of them telling war stories, left quite an impression. I remember two things from that conversation from 60 years ago. The first was Karl, when speaking about his Iron Cross, saying, "You know how they would often chain the soldiers to the machine guns so they wouldn't run away in battle? They did not have to chain me." And the other was Uncle Fred saying, after Karl had left, that there was no difference between an Iron Cross first class and second class, other than first class was awarded only to officers and second class was awarded to enlisted men. Obviously, this left a deep impression with me that I can still remember it clearly. Two war veterans from different wars, from different sides, forming a connection that I think can only be understood by men who have seen the face of battle firsthand. So last year, when cousin Tricia said she had German medals from her dad and saying, my vague memory is that they were given to Grandma Schwandt to give to Dad from a neighbor, I knew exactly who the neighbor was. Karl chose well. Uncle Fred will honor the memory of a fellow soldier, and he would pass this respect on to his children. To know that the medals I first saw decades ago, now returning to Strasbourg for a permanent home, is most appropriate. Tricia, you have the medals. You'll have to come up and do the presentation. Do you have the names of the medals?
Yes.
I have them here. We're not sure. They're there too. You have them there from her as well. Okay. We're not exactly sure when Karl came. His brother came in the 20s, and his kids went to Last Mountain School, which is actually where our grandparents went to their one-room school. So that must be just back by one eye, I assume, that that's where Last Mountain School is. Anyway, one is the Honor of Cross.
This was the school that was taken off the Strasbourg school.
Okay, so I'm okay. The Honor of Cross, World War 1914 to 1918. The Iron Cross, second class, 1914-18. World War I. Cross of Honor for a German mother. The decoration was conferred from 1939 to 45, and that was for mothers who had lots of kids. So from that we can assume that Karl must have come after the Second World War if his mother had that. And then the King's Shooting Award. So these are the awards that will now find their home permanently in the Strasbourg Museum. As my brother said, very appropriate. Yes?
You know when Karl died?
Yes, Karl died in 89 at the age of 98. Yeah. Must have been, he got his well water from Grandma and Grandpa. That was, there was a well on their place, and it was before the town had sewage and then running water, and they came over daily to get a pail of water. So it must be a good one. Yeah, 98. Anyway, so that's the story of those medals.
Oh, interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roger. That's another very interesting piece of local history. And by looking at the Mother's Cross, because it's a bronze level cross, you had to have 4 or 5 children. So that's what it was for, 4 or 5. That's in the documentation here, what the awards were for. And another footnote to the Iron Cross second class. If you did something on the battlefield that exemplified bravery a second time, then you were awarded the Iron Cross first class, regardless of rank. It did not matter which rank. Everybody had to start with Iron Cross second class, which is this one, and then the second time you would get the pin on that didn't have the ribbon pin right onto your uniform. So when you see in a movie a ribbon through a buttonhole, that's the Iron Cross second class ribbon, and they might have one on their left breast, which is the Iron Cross first class. And then this award here, the Honor Cross, was given to all First World War veterans by the German government. This is the first award presented by the Nazi government of Germany, but to First World War veterans. And this one is a combat cross because it's got the swords. If it didn't have any swords, the recipient did not receive any, did not have any combat experience. So a little bit of detail to those. Thank you so much. This is just fascinating. History, local history, and world history all rolled into one. Now, I've been asked, or should I say voluntold, by our Legion President to bring greetings on behalf of the Silton Legion number 33, President Linda Glass, and it's my distinct pleasure to do so. I may have joked about being told to do so, but I'm very, very pleased to be here. The Silton Legion number 33 has taken over responsibility for the Strasbourg area after the cessation of operations of the Strasbourg Legion. And we do have many comrades here from the Strasbourg area in the Silton Legion. The mandate of the Royal Canadian Legion is to honour the memories of all those who have served in the armed forces or police forces. The Legion also advocates for those veterans who need support either by or with their dealings with the government or in the cases of healthcare. Today we are very pleased to have been asked to be a part of this program honouring 2 men who volunteered to serve Canada in its time of need and to protect the peacetime security through United Nations missions. Canada has a reputation of willingly and quietly going about protecting that peace and making the world a more safe and secure place by taking part in many missions around the globe. This is demonstrated here today when you look at Major Swan, if you want to say Schwandt, but Swan's medal set. Silton Legion 33 is most pleased to have had the opportunity to honour the memories of these 2 Canadians. We also are pleased to recognise the member of the community having served their country before immigrating to Canada, and we recognise Mr. Karl Wolfe's sacrifices that he made for Germany in the Great War of 1914 to 1918. So on behalf of the Silton Legion, we thank you for being able to be a part of this program today. We're going to conclude our program today. I'm going to, in a moment, ask everyone to stand for the Act of Remembrance, which will be followed by singing of God Save the Queen, as led by Peter Frostad, and then remain standing also for the exit of the colours. And then please stay for some cake and coffee and to meet people you may not have seen in many years, to have a look at the beautiful presentation here, to see Karl's medals, or to look through any of the documentation that gives you some background to those medals. So at this point, I'll ask you to stand for the Act of Remembrance. They shall not grow old as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we shall remember them.
We will remember them.
Peter, if I can ask you to start God Save the Queen.
God save our gracious Queen, long live our noble Queen. God save the Queen. Send her victorious, happy and glorious, long to reign over us. God save the Queen.
Thank you so much. That concludes our program this afternoon.
Thanks, Larry.